The morning Coralie Marsh agreed to become a stranger's wife, she had exactly two choices left, and one of them was a slow death. She stood in the back room of the Millhaven post office, reading the letter a third time in the thin November light that came through a window someone had painted over half shut. The letter was brief. The handwriting was the kind a man produced when he'd taught himself to write late in life, careful but graceless, each word planted like a fence post. I have a son, age 7, a ranch of 400 acres outside Copper Falls. The work is hard and I won't pretend otherwise. I need someone who can cook and keep a house and deal with a child who hasn't spoken much since his mother passed. I'm not looking for anything more than that. If you're practical and not given to complaint, write back. It was signed Silas Holt. No pleasantries, no promises. No mention of what he looked like, or how old he was, or whether he was the kind of man who hit. Coralie folded the letter along its existing crease. She thought about the $3.40 left in the tobacco tin under her cot at Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house, and the way Mrs. Fenwick had looked at her that morning over the breakfast table. Not unkind, just tired of the situation. She wrote back the same afternoon. I'm practical. I don't complain. When do you need me there? 3 weeks later, she was on a stagecoach heading west with a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world and a name sewn into the lining of her coat. Her sister's name, Eleanor, because Eleanor had given her the coat 2 winters ago, when Coralie's own was stolen off a clothesline, and Coralie had never gotten around to removing the stitching. She arrived in Copper Falls on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to snow or just stay threatening. The town was smaller than she'd expected. One main street, a feed store, a saloon with a faded sign, a church with fresh white paint that made everything around it look worse by comparison. A few men stood outside the general store, watching the stage pull in with the specific blankness of people who didn't have anywhere better to be. Silas Holt was waiting by the post office. She recognized him, not because she'd imagined him any particular way, but because he was the only man standing apart from the others, and because he was watching the stage with the expression of someone bracing for an unpleasant appointment. He was taller than she expected, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been out in weather for enough years that the sun had burned a permanent wariness into it. He held his hat in both hands, and his jaw was set like a man who'd made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of what stepped off that coach. He looked at her once when she climbed down, a quick assessment that started at her face and ended somewhere around her hands, the way a person sizes up whether someone is capable of work. Miss Marsh, he said, Mr. Holt. That was how they introduced themselves. He picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it, not gallantry, she would understand later, just efficiency, and led her to a wagon where a boy of about 7 sat on the bench with his arms wrapped around his own middle. The boy had his father's dark eyes and a careful stillness about him that didn't look like shyness. It looked like a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible. This is my son, Caleb, Silas said. The boy looked at her. He didn't say anything. Hello, Caleb, she said. He looked away at the street. Silas helped her up onto the wagon bench without comment. They married that evening in the pastor's front parlor, just the 4 of them counting Pastor Hendricks and his wife, who served as witness and looked at Coralie with an expression that balanced somewhere between pity and prayer. The ceremony took 8 minutes. Silas said his vows like a man reciting something he'd committed to memory and needed to get through. Coralie said hers steadily because her voice had never learned to shake, even when the rest of her wanted to. Afterward, Pastor Hendricks' wife pressed Coralie's hand and said, You're brave, dear. Coralie didn't know what to do with that, so she just thanked her. Silas drove them home in the dark. The road out to the ranch took 40 minutes through scrub pine and open range, and neither adult said anything for the first 30. Caleb sat between them with his shoulder just barely touching Coralie's arm, which she chose not to read into. There's a room off the kitchen, Silas said finally, as if continuing a conversation that had started somewhere she'd missed. You'll have it to yourself. Door has a latch. All right. I get up at 5. Breakfast is your call on timing, but I need to be in the barn by 6, understood. Another stretch of dark road. An owl called somewhere to the left of them. Caleb doesn't give trouble, Silas said. He's just quiet. I noticed. She paused. That's fine. He glanced at her once, quick, then back at the road. She got the sense that he'd expected her to ask why the boy didn't talk, and was trying to decide what to make of the fact that she hadn't. His mother died 14 months ago, he said. I know. You mentioned in the letter. Right. He adjusted the reins in his hands. Just so you understand the situation. I understand it. The ranch appeared out of the darkness at the crest of a low hill. A main house, a barn, outbuildings, fences that she could tell even at night had sections needing repair. Everything looked like something that had been well built once and had spent the last year being held together by intention and not much else. She would come to understand that feeling over the next few days. Inside, the house was clean but bare. Whoever had kept it before, his wife, Coralie assumed, had left behind certain practical things. Good cast iron, a solid kitchen table, curtains on the windows. But the curtains were faded and the furniture was worn and there was nothing decorative anywhere. No softness, no evidence of anything beyond function. It was a house someone was enduring, not inhabiting. Silas showed her the room off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out onto the side yard. He set her carpet bag down just inside the door. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, and then he went to his own room and closed the door, and that was the end of the first night. Coralie sat on the edge of the bed in her coat for a while, listening to the ranch settle into silence around her. She thought about her sister Eleanor in St. Louis, who had 3 children, and a husband who worked at the rail yard and a small house that smelled like bread and coal smoke. She'd offered to let Coralie stay when things went bad after their parents died. But Eleanor's husband had made it clear that his generosity had a term limit, and Coralie had too much pride to test it. She unpinned her hair and braided it for sleep, and told herself that tomorrow she would figure out what kind of life this was going to be. She got up at 4:30, without needing to be woken, and had coffee on the stove by the time she heard Silas moving through the house. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her, as if he'd expected the room to be empty. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured himself a cup and drank it standing at the counter, which she understood was not unfriendliness but just habit. "There's eggs," he said. "Chickens out back. I'll find them." He nodded and went to the barn. She made scrambled eggs and biscuits and set a plate aside for when he came back, and meanwhile Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his boots on the wrong feet. She didn't comment on the boots. She just set his breakfast on the table. He ate the whole thing, which she took as a good sign. The days built a structure around themselves. Silas worked the ranch from before dawn until after dark, coming in for meals and then going back out. Caleb followed her sometimes with a deliberateness that was neither asking for attention nor refusing it. Just presence, the way a cat will sit in the same room without making a case for itself. She let him help with small things, carrying flour from the pantry, feeding the chickens. He didn't speak, but he watched everything she did with a focus that suggested he was taking it all in. On the 5th day, she found the account book. It was on the kitchen shelf between 2 volumes of almanac, unremarkable except that it had been shoved to the back. She pulled it out while Silas was in the south field and Caleb was napping. She opened it expecting household accounts. What she found instead was a record of debt. The numbers weren't hidden, just not organized in a way that showed you the whole picture unless you laid them out properly. Which she did, at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, her old habit from keeping her father's ledgers. Supply costs that had jumped without explanation. Loans against the cattle that came due sooner than the corresponding income could cover them. Contracts for beef sales that had been renegotiated down twice, just in the last year. And a name that appeared in the margin of several entries. Crane, per arrangement. She didn't know who Crane was yet. She put the book back before Silas returned and said nothing at supper. But she thought about those numbers all through the meal and into the night, the way you think about a knot that you can see but can't yet reach. She started paying attention differently after that. She noticed that Silas was quieter than usual on certain mornings, and that those mornings always seemed to follow the same pattern. A writer coming out from town late the previous evening, a conversation on the porch that lasted less than 5 minutes, Silas standing at the fence, afterward, staring at nothing. She noticed that the cattle count didn't match what was written in the book, and she noticed that whenever she mentioned the supply costs in passing, casually, the way someone might comment on weather, something in Silas's expression shifted, like a man who is keeping a door shut and hoping you won't try the handle. 2 weeks after she arrived, a man rode up to the house on a horse that cost more than the barn it was standing next to. He was maybe 45, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had learned to arrange itself pleasantly without involving the eyes. He dismounted and walked toward her with his hand already extended, as if his arrival were a courtesy he was doing her. "Mrs. Holt, I presume. I'm Edmund Crane. I have an arrangement with your husband's operation." His grip was firm for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "I was hoping to catch Silas in, but perhaps you can help me. We've been discussing some options regarding the ranch's future. I'd love for you to hear them directly." Everything about him was polished in a way that cost money and effort both. He was the kind of man who had learned that appearing generous was more useful than being it. "I'll let Silas know you called," Coralie said. Of course, he smiled, though I want you to know, speaking as someone who's watched this ranch struggle for the past year, there's no shame in making a practical decision. Sometimes the land is willing, but the circumstances aren't. He glanced at the house, the fencing, the general air of things held together by will. Silas is a proud man. That's admirable, but pride doesn't repair fences. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. I appreciate your concern. He left and she watched his horse until it rounded the tree line and disappeared. Then she went inside and pulled out that account book again and started looking at the name Crane with different eyes. She told Silas at supper. She set the account book beside his plate before she sat down. He looked at it, then at her. Where did you find that? Kitchen shelf. I wasn't searching. I was reorganizing the pantry. She kept her voice even. I have some questions about the numbers. The numbers are my business. They're our business now. She said it without heat. I've been keeping books since I was 14. My father ran a freight company in Tennessee before he died. I know what deliberate loss looks like. Silas's jaw worked. He looked at the book, not at her. What do you mean, deliberate? She laid out what she'd found. The supply costs inflated past any market explanation. The cattle contracts renegotiated down both times through Crane's arrangement. The loan schedule designed to mature at the exact moment the ranch's income cycle bottomed out. He was quiet for a long time. She let the silence sit. Crane handles sales and supply contracts, he said finally. After Nell died, I couldn't. I was dealing with Caleb and the ranch, and I couldn't also be chasing buyers in 3 counties. He offered to take over the negotiating side. He's been doing it for 2 years. And things started going wrong. Things started going wrong when my wife died. Yes. She kept her voice careful. But sometimes when things go wrong, someone else makes sure they keep going wrong. Because that benefits them. Silas looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't done since she stepped off the stage. She saw him running it backward in his head, all the deals that hadn't come through, all the suppliers that had raised their prices, all the buyers who'd suddenly gone cold. She saw him arrive somewhere he hadn't wanted to go. Crane wants this land, she said. What's it adjacent to? He got up from the table without answering and came back with a survey map. He spread it on the table beside their cold supper. His property runs along here, he said, pointing. 3,000 acres, but it's landlocked on 2 sides by Federal Reserve. The only route to the rail depot runs through this section. His finger moved to indicate the eastern portion of Holt land, which I own. She looked at the map. The picture was clean and simple and terrible. He controls your contracts, your supply costs, your loan schedule. He runs you into the ground. Then he buys the land from a man who has no other options. You don't know that? No, but I'd like to find out. She met his eyes. May I keep looking at the books? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd say no. Then, what are you looking for exactly? Proof of something specific. A contract? A letter? A name? Something that connects his interference to a real transaction that someone else could verify independently. She paused. Do you have correspondence from your buyers? The ones who changed their minds? Some. In the desk. Then let's start there. They worked at the kitchen table until well past midnight. Silas pulled letters from the desk drawer, laid them out by date. Coralie matched them to the account book entries, building a timeline on the paper she'd been using for tallies. Caleb had woken at some point and come silently to the kitchen doorway, watching them from the threshold. Silas told him to go back to bed. Caleb looked at Coralie instead of his father. Go on, she said gently. We'll still be here in the morning. He went. The word still had come out of her mouth before she'd thought about it, and she wondered briefly what it had landed like for him. Whether it sounded like a promise or just a statement of fact. By the time they finished for the night, they had enough of a picture to be useful, if not enough to be definitive. 3 buyers who had all cited quality concerns within weeks of each other, suggesting a coordinated source for those concerns. Supply invoices that didn't match any of the market prices she could cross-reference from the almanac records on the shelf. And a letter from Crane that contained the phrase, as per our mutual interest in a smooth resolution. Language that could mean anything, and therefore suggested everything. This isn't proof, she said, gathering the papers. Not the kind that holds up? No. But it's enough to be careful. She looked at him. Crane thinks you're a man running out of time and options. He doesn't know I've seen any of this. I think we should keep it that way for now. Silas studied her across the table the way she'd seen him study a fence line. Not admiring it, just trying to determine where the weak spots were. Why are you doing this? He said. You've been here 2 weeks. This wasn't in the arrangement. The arrangement is that this is my home now, she said. If someone is trying to take it, that's my problem too. He didn't respond. But the way he gathered the letters and put them carefully back in the desk, methodically, the way you handle something that's become important, told her he'd heard her. The thing she hadn't expected was Caleb. Not the silence, which she'd been warned about, but the way the silence had its own texture. Some mornings it was closed off, tight, the way a house is when someone doesn't want you in it. Other mornings it was different, open, watchful, almost asking. She learned to read the difference without making anything of either. She started leaving small things around. Not for him specifically. Just a biscuit on the counter when she knew he'd been in the kitchen. A pencil and paper on the table when she noticed him watching her write. A book left open on the window seat where she'd seen him sit. He took all of it without comment. He did not, as his father had said, give any trouble. About 3 weeks in, she was mending a saddle pad in the front room when Caleb came and sat on the floor near her feet, with a piece of paper and the pencil, and started drawing. She didn't look at what he was drawing, she just kept mending. After a while, he held the paper up. It was a horse, recognizably, with a person on it. The person had a long braid down her back. That's a good horse, she said. He nodded, put the paper down, and drew something else. She didn't push for more. But later that evening at supper, she caught Silas watching the two of them with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not relief exactly, more like a man who had been bracing for something for a long time and wasn't sure it was safe yet to stop. The next development came from an unexpected direction. A woman named Harriet Bowman came to the ranch on a Wednesday with a pie and what turned out to be information she'd been sitting on for a month, deciding whether to share. She ran the seamstress shop in Copper Falls and had the particular kind of hearing that develops in people whose customers feel at ease around thread and needles. She sat at the kitchen table with Coralie and ate a slice of her own pie and said, "Eventually, there's talk in town about the Holt Ranch." "About it being sold off? Sold to whom?" Coralie said. "Edmund Crane's name is what people are saying. He's been telling folks it's just a matter of time, that Silas can't manage it much longer on his own." Harriet looked at her directly. "I thought you should know that's the version of events he's been circulating, before anything becomes a fact." Coralie thanked her and sent her home with the rest of the pie. She told Silas that evening. He sat very still, and she watched the pieces arriving in his face, the understanding that this had already gone public, that Crane was already treating his failure as decided, already positioning himself as the natural solution. "He's not even waiting," Silas said. "No. Which means he thinks you're already done." She paused. "Which means he doesn't know we're looking." They kept looking. Coralie wrote a letter to one of the buyers in the stack of correspondence, a man named Aldridge, who ran a meat-packing operation 2 counties east. She wrote it carefully, in the tone of someone conducting normal business. "We are reviewing our contracts for the coming season and wanted to touch base about your decision not to renew. We understood there were quality concerns raised. Could you help us understand the source of those concerns so we can address them appropriately?" The reply came 8 days later. Aldridge had been contacted by a representative acting on behalf of the Holt operation, he wrote, who had expressed that the cattle were being managed below standard due to the owner's health limitations. The representative had suggested Aldridge consider another supplier instead, and had provided contact information for that other supplier, which turned out to be a company Coralie found, after an afternoon with the almanac and the account book, to have an address 2 streets from Crane's office in Maple Creek. She put the letter in front of Silas without saying anything. He read it twice. The second time she saw his hands go flat on the table, the way a man's hands go when he's keeping them from doing something else. "That's his company," Silas said. "I believe so. He told Aldridge we were failing and then steered his business to himself, while also making sure we were actually failing by inflating your costs and arranging your loans to come due at the worst possible time." She sat down across from him. "It's the same shape as the map. He's on all sides of it." The silence that followed was different from Silas's usual silences. This one had weight and direction. "What do we do with it?" he said. "We take it to someone who can act on it. The sheriff in Copper Falls, or better, the Territorial Land Office in Maple Creek. Because this isn't just theft, it's fraud. The loan arrangements especially. Crane has friends in Maple Creek, probably, but Aldridge's letter is a paper trail with no ambiguity. If we go to the right person and bring everything we have, it's hard to explain away." She paused. "Before we do, though, I want to know about the loan itself." "Who holds the paper?" he told her. The loan was held by a bank in Maple Creek, arranged through an intermediary, whose name, when she looked it up in the correspondence, was a cousin of Crane's. She added that to the timeline on her paper. They went to the territorial office on a Thursday, both of them, leaving Caleb with Harriet Bowman, who had by then become the kind of ally who didn't ask for explanation. The drive to Maple Creek took 3 hours. For the first hour, they didn't talk much. For the second, Silas told her about the ranch when he'd built it, when he'd first brought his wife Nell out here, when Caleb was born, when things were good. He said it the way a person recites facts, but she understood that he was letting her know something about the place she'd come to inhabit, that it had been loved, that it was worth fighting for, not just as property but as the actual shape of someone's life. She didn't say much in response. She just listened and let it settle. The territorial officer was a man named Garvey, gray-haired, deliberate, the kind of official who reads things twice before he forms an expression. He read everything twice. Then he looked up at them across his desk. "This is a serious set of allegations," he said. "Yes," Silas said. "If the intermediary on this loan is related to Crane, that's a conflict of interest the bank is going to have to answer for." Garvey tapped the Aldridge letter. "This is the most concrete thing you have. The buyer's own words stating that someone represented themselves as acting for your operation and steered the business elsewhere." "What can you do with it?" Coralie asked. "I can open an investigation, freeze the loan proceedings, while we look at the conflict of interest question. That buys you time." He looked at Silas. "You need to be careful. Crane is going to know something's shifted when the bank contacts him." "I know. He may not respond well. I know that too." They drove home in the late afternoon light, the mountains going orange behind them. Caleb was asleep at Harriet's when they arrived, and they brought him home wrapped in his blanket and put him in his bed without waking him. In the kitchen, Silas made coffee, which was the first time she'd seen him do that. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. "That was good work," he said. "The Aldridge letter especially. It was the right question at the right time." Still, he wrapped both hands around his cup. "You've been here 5 weeks. You didn't have to do any of this. I told you before, this is my home now." He looked at her in the straight-on way he had, that didn't feel intrusive but did feel honest. "You didn't ask to be here," he said. "I know that. I know this wasn't anyone's first choice." "No," she agreed. "But sometimes the choice that isn't first turns out to be right anyway." She paused. "I've been in situations where no one helped me when they could have. I made myself a promise after that." She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask her to. "Your father's freight company," he said after a moment. "What happened to it?" "He died and my brother-in-law took over management and ran it into the ground in 8 months." She said it without bitterness, just fact. "He wasn't dishonest, just not capable. 2 different problems, and you left. Eleanor had enough to manage. I wasn't going to be another thing she had to carry." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not a thing to be carried." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. "No," she said, "I'm not." Crane arrived 4 days later. He came without the pleasant face this time. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize and a copy of the loan paperwork, and an expression that had dropped all its pretense. Silas came to the porch when he heard the horses. Coralie stood at his shoulder. "I don't know what you think you've done," Crane said, addressing Silas, "but involving the territorial office in a private business arrangement is going to create more problems for you than it solves. If the arrangement was legitimate, the territorial office will confirm that." Silas's voice was even. "Silas." Crane's tone shifted, trying something older. Familiarity, the weight of 2 men who'd done business together. "I've been trying to help you. You've been struggling since Nell died, anyone can see that. I offered a solution. You offered to buy land you'd been making sure I couldn't afford to keep." Crane's expression went flat. "That's an accusation you can't prove." "The buyer in Aldridge County disagrees," Coralie said. Crane looked at her. She watched him decide how to handle her, recalculate. She could almost see it happening. The moment he understood she was not a domestic detail, but a problem he'd failed to account for. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "You don't know the history of this arrangement." "I know the numbers," she said. "I know what they add up to. The bank has been contacted about the conflict of interest on the loan intermediary," she said. "That review is ongoing." She kept her voice entirely pleasant. "If everything is as legitimate as you say, the review will confirm it and will owe you an apology." He looked at her for a moment longer. She had been looked at like this before. By her brother-in-law when she'd shown him the mistake in the freight accounts. By creditors who'd come to her father's door and expected someone easy to push past. She'd learned not to shift her weight or look away. Crane turned his horse without another word and his men went with him. They stood on the porch until the horses disappeared down the drive. Then Silas exhaled. "He'll try something else," he said. "Probably, but now he knows we're not surprised." She looked out at the empty drive. "And now the territorial office knows we exist, and Garvey struck me as someone who doesn't like having his time wasted." Inside, Caleb was standing in the front room in his socks. He'd heard enough from wherever he'd been, she thought, to understand at least that something important had just happened. He looked at his father and then at her with that careful measuring look that she'd come to understand was not absence but presence, all of him attending. "It's all right," she said. "Go put your boots on. I need help with the chickens." He went and got his boots. She noticed he put them on the right feet. The investigation moved slowly, the way territorial offices move when they're being careful. But it moved. Garvey was methodical. He found in the loan documents language that gave Crane's cousin's company a right of first refusal on the property in case of default, language that had not been explained to Silas when he signed, and that, Garvey noted in his written findings, appeared to have been inserted after the original terms were agreed upon. That was fraud. It was documentable, specific, and impossible to explain away with a story about a struggling rancher misunderstanding his own situation. Crane was issued a formal notice. The loan terms were suspended pending review. 3 of the supply companies, contacted by Garvey's office, admitted that their pricing had been influenced by Crane's representatives, with the suggestion that the Holt operation was not a reliable long-term customer. He didn't come back to the ranch. He sent a lawyer instead, and the lawyer had less leverage than Crane had expected, and the discussion was brief. The evening after the formal resolution came through. No criminal charges, ultimately, which was the frustrating part, but the loan voided, the right of first refusal struck, and Crane's access to the ranch's contracts permanently severed. Silas sat on the porch steps after Caleb was in bed. Coralie brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. The sky was doing something extravagant with the last of the sunset, purple and gold stacked up over the western ridge. "It's not all fixed," he said. "No, the financial hole is still real. It'll take 2 or 3 good seasons." "I know." He turned his cup in his hands. "But it's ours to fix now. That's different." She understood what he meant. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from fighting something invisible, something that looked like bad luck, but was actually a hand on the back of your head pushing you under. Having a name for it, and having it named publicly, changed the weight of things. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "The day you arrived. I wasn't easy about it. Any of it. The arrangement, having a stranger come into the house, all of it." He looked at her sideways. "You must have seen that." "I saw it," she said. "Did it scare you off?" She thought about it honestly. No. A man who was easy about a stranger in his house would have been more worrying. She paused. "What scared me was whether you'd be the kind of person who took the difficulty out on people around you. And you weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "Caleb's doing better," he said. "Since you came, Caleb was doing better than you realized already. He just needed someone to be consistent. I thought I was consistent. You were. But you were also grieving." She chose her words carefully. A child understands that even when they don't have language for it. He needed someone whose grief wasn't about his mother. Silas was very still for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man accepting a piece of information that cost something. "She was a good woman," he said. "Nell, I want you to know that's not. This isn't about replacing her. I know it isn't. It's just." He stopped. Started again. "I wrote that letter because I needed help and I didn't know another way to ask for it. I wasn't trying to offer you much." "You offered what you had," she said. "That's enough to start with." He looked at her then in the fading light with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the assessment from the stage stop, not the guarded wariness of the early weeks. Something quieter. Something that was trying to figure out what she was to him now that the emergency had passed. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone temporary." He said it like he was admitting something. Someone who'd manage until she found something better. She turned that over. "And now? Now I think." He stopped. "Seemed to decide something. I'd like you to stay. Not because of the arrangement, because I'd like you to." She looked at the mountains, dark against the last of the sky. She thought about the boarding house in Millhaven and the tobacco tin and Mrs. Fenwick's tired expression. She thought about Eleanor's coal smoke house and the coat with the name sewn in the lining. She thought about the account book on the kitchen shelf and the timeline she'd built, and Caleb's drawing of a person with a braid. "I'd like that too," she said. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything more, which she found she was glad about. There was time for more. That was the thing about making it through the worst of something. It didn't require you to rush what came after. Winter settled over Copper Falls hard and early. The first real snow came in December and kept coming in slow waves that left the world white and quiet and smaller seeming, all the distances pressed close. Coralie had never spent a winter this far west, and she hadn't expected the particular beauty of it. The way the cold turned everything stark and honest. Caleb spoke for the first time, actually spoke, a full sentence, on a Thursday in January. She had been reaching for a jar on the high shelf and couldn't quite get to it, and he came to stand beside her and said, "Clear as anything, I can get it if you move the chair." She moved the chair. He got the jar. He handed it to her. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, exactly the same as she'd said anything else to him in the 2 months prior. "You're welcome," he said. And that was that. By February, he was talking in the ordinary, unremarkable way of a boy who had things to say, and had decided the time was right to say them. Silas heard him come out with a long story about the horses at supper one evening and said nothing about it, just listened with the careful stillness of a man trying not to make the moment fragile. Later, when Caleb had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands for a moment, and Coralie left him to it. After a while he looked up and said, "Thank you." "He did that himself," she said. "I just didn't make it difficult still." She poured them both coffee and sat down. They stayed at the table a long time, talking about the spring plans for the ranch, which pastures to rotate, which fence sections to prioritize, whether it was worth trying to negotiate directly with Aldridge's operation, now that the crane problem was cleared. It was the conversation of two people making plans together, and at some point in the middle of it she recognized that it felt like something she hadn't expected. Ordinary. Good in the specific way that ordinary things become good when you've spent a long time outside of them. The ranch was not saved all at once. That was the part stories usually rushed past, the actual slow work of recovery, season by season. One good cattle sale led to one repaired fence section, led to one replaced piece of equipment. And by the following fall they were not thriving exactly, but they were stable, which was a different and better thing than it sounded. Silas expanded the operation in small ways. He hired a hand in spring, a young man named Orville who was new to the territory and worked hard and didn't complain, which were the only qualities Silas required. Coralie kept the books the way she'd always kept books, carefully with the full picture visible at all times, and she made sure the contracts were ones she'd read before Silas signed them. On a morning in May, she was in the garden behind the house when Silas came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw her. She'd put in a small kitchen garden in late March, more optimism than plan, and it had started coming in. Neat rows of beans and onion and a struggling but alive tomato plant that she'd carried from a seedling a jar of preserves for. "You didn't have to do all that," Silas said. "I know." She straightened up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I wanted to." He looked at the garden the way he looked at things on the ranch, assessing but not without feeling. "It's good," he said. "Nell used to have a garden. She could never get the tomatoes to cooperate either." "These will cooperate," Coralie said. "I've had words with them." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh without any guardedness in it, just the plain sound of it, and it changed the look of him entirely. Younger, less carved. She stored the sound of it away the way she'd stored everything useful since she'd come here. That evening at supper, Caleb informed them both at length about the character flaws of a particular rooster who had been giving him trouble. Silas ate his supper and listened with the expression of a man who is exactly where he means to be. And Coralie thought about the letter she'd read 3 times in the thin winter light of a Millhaven post office. I'm not looking for anything more than that, and how wrong that had turned out to be, for both of them. Not wrong in the sense of a lie. Wrong in the sense of not yet knowing what you were capable of offering or receiving when the right circumstances came together and the right person showed up, and neither of you ran from the work of it. She had not run, neither had he. That was, in the end, what it came down to. 2 people who had both lost things they hadn't expected to lose, who had made a practical decision in difficult circumstances, and who had found in the daily work of building something together that practical and real were not opposites, that a home was what you made it. That love was less like a rival and more like a garden in the western soil, unlikely, stubborn, requiring words and patience, and the willingness to tend it even when you weren't sure it would take. It took.